A stray dog took in 3 wild bear cubs, and even scientists couldn't believe it. The mountains surrounding Bozeman, Montana, wore their first winter coat, a light dusting of snow that clung to the pines and dusted the abandoned ski resort like powdered sugar. Most wildlife had already retreated to their winter shelters, but one creature still roamed the edges of the resort. Her golden fur was matted and dirty, ribs visible beneath her once luxurious coat. Maggie, as she would later be named, had been abandoned months ago when the summer tourists departed. Someone had likely brought her as a vacation companion, then decided she was too much trouble to take home. She'd given birth to a litter of puppies that spring, but they'd been taken from her and given away to good homes while she was left behind, a disposable pet whose maternal instincts now had nowhere to go. She survived on scraps and small game, navigating the boundary between the abandoned resort and the dense Montana forest with the weariness of an animal who had learned that humans could not be trusted. Her once friendly demeanor had hardened into cautious vigilance, though a shadow of her gentle nature remained beneath the survival instincts she'd been forced to develop. On this particular evening, with the temperature dropping rapidly and the wind carrying the promise of a heavy snowfall, Maggie was hunting along the forest edge. Her keen nose detected something unusual, a scent that triggered memories of her own puppies, of small, vulnerable bodies that needed protection. Following the scent, she discovered a hollow beneath a massive fallen pine, and inside, 3 small black bear cubs huddled together, trembling with cold and weakness. Their fur was soaked from the melting snow, their tiny bodies shivering violently. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, far too young to be alone with winter setting in. Maggie approached cautiously, her instincts conflicted. These weren't her puppies, weren't even dogs, but something deep inside her recognized their desperation. The largest cub, who would later be called Bruno, growled weakly, attempting to protect his siblings despite his own exhaustion. The middle cub, later named Scout, watched Maggie with intelligent eyes, assessing whether she was a threat. The smallest, eventually called Clover, could barely lift her head, her energy nearly depleted. Maggie made no threatening moves. She simply lay down at the entrance to their hollow, blocking the wind and offering her body heat. The cubs, too weak and cold to resist, eventually crept closer to her warmth. By morning, all 3 were pressed against her belly, their breathing steady in sleep. When dawn broke, Maggie's maternal instincts took full control. She left the cubs briefly, returning to an abandoned campsite where she'd found food before. There, she rummaged through trash until she found half-eaten sandwiches and the remains of a packet of jerky. She carried these treasures back to the cubs, dropping them in front of the hungry little bears. Bruno was the first to investigate, sniffing the offerings cautiously before taking a small bite. Scout followed, and seeing no ill effects, Clover joined in. It wasn't the milk they needed from their mother, but it gave them energy they desperately required. Over the next days, Maggie established a routine. She scavenged for food, brought it back to the cubs, and spent the rest of her time creating a more suitable den. She dragged dry leaves and rotting straw to line the hollow, forming a nest that would insulate them from the cold ground. At night, she curled around them, her body heat and the dry bedding keeping the worst of the cold at bay. When foxes or martens approached, drawn by the scent of the vulnerable cubs, Maggie transformed from gentle caretaker to fierce protector. Her hackles raised, teeth bared, she charged at any predator that ventured too close, her barks and growls echoing through the trees. The local predators quickly learned to give her makeshift den a wide berth. Winter had truly taken hold of the mountains when the Carter family ventured into the forest one Saturday morning. Daniel Carter, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard and gentle eyes, led the way. Once a forest ranger, he now worked as a carpenter in Bozeman, but he had never lost his love for the wilderness. His wife Laura, a slender woman with laugh lines around her eyes and premature silver streaking her dark hair, followed close behind. Their 12-year-old daughter Ellie brought up the rear, her red knit cap visible among the trees as she searched for the perfect branches to collect for kindling. "Dad, look," Ellie's voice rang out, high with excitement. "There's a dog over there." Daniel turned, following his daughter's pointing finger. Through the trees, he could make out a flash of golden fur. "Stay back, Ellie," he cautioned. "It might be a coyote." "No way," Ellie protested. "It's definitely a dog. Look at its tail." Laura moved to her daughter's side, squinting through the trees. "She's right, Daniel. That's a dog, and it looks like it's guarding something." Daniel approached cautiously, signaling for his wife and daughter to stay back. As he drew closer, he could see that the golden-furred dog was indeed standing protectively at the entrance to a hollow beneath a fallen tree. What shocked him was what the dog was protecting: 3 small black shapes that he immediately recognized as bear cubs. "Laura," he called softly, "come here, but slowly. You've got to see this." Laura joined him, her breath catching as she realized what they were seeing. "Are those bear cubs?" Daniel confirmed. "And that dog is protecting them." Unable to contain her curiosity, Ellie darted forward to join her parents. Her gasp was audible as she took in the scene: a skinny golden retriever standing guard over 3 small black bear cubs huddled in a nest of leaves and straw. As they watched, the dog, Maggie, turned to the smallest cub, which appeared weaker than the others. She began licking its fur methodically, the same way a mother dog would clean her puppies. The gesture was so tender, so maternal, that Ellie burst into tears. "They're all alone," she sobbed. "Where's their mom? Why is the dog taking care of them?" Daniel's ranger training kicked in as he observed the scene. "The mother bear is probably dead," he said grimly. "Maybe shot by poachers or caught in a trap. These cubs are too young to survive winter without her." "That dog is trying to be their mom," Ellie said, wiping her eyes. "She's saving them." Daniel nodded, his expression troubled. "She's doing her best, but they won't make it out here, not through a Montana winter." "But we have to help them," Laura said firmly. "We can't just leave them here to die." Daniel ran a hand through his beard, his forehead creased with worry. "If we report this to wildlife conservation, they'll take the cubs. This time of year, with resources stretched thin, they might just euthanize them. They're too young for rehabilitation and release." "No." Ellie's cry was anguished. "Dad, we can't let them die." Laura placed a hand on her husband's arm. "What if we took them home? Just until spring?" Daniel stared at his wife in shock. "Laura, that's illegal. We could get in serious trouble." "I know," she replied, her jaw set stubbornly. "But can you walk away from this? Can you report them, knowing what will probably happen?" Daniel looked back at the scene before them, the loyal dog standing guard over the orphaned cubs, protecting them with everything she had despite her own desperate condition. He thought of the oath he'd taken as a ranger to protect wildlife, and the moral code he'd always tried to live by. "No," he said finally. "I can't walk away. But this won't be easy." Approaching the dog was the first challenge. Daniel moved slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. The retriever growled, positioning herself between the humans and the cubs. "It's okay, girl," Daniel murmured. "We want to help. We want to help you take care of them." It took nearly an hour of patient coaxing before the dog allowed Daniel close enough to offer her a piece of beef jerky from his pocket. She took it cautiously, then allowed him to scratch behind her ears. Only then did she step aside, giving him access to the cubs. Each cub was carefully wrapped in the Carter family's spare jackets. The dog watched anxiously but didn't interfere, seeming to understand they were trying to help. When Daniel picked up the smallest cub, the golden retriever whined and paced nervously. "It's okay," Ellie told the dog, kneeling beside her mom. "We're taking them somewhere warm. You can come too." Whether the dog understood the words or just responded to Ellie's gentle tone, she followed when they began walking back toward their truck, staying close to the cubs. The ride home was tense, with Laura cradling the smallest cub on her lap, while the other two were nestled in a cardboard box on the back seat with Ellie keeping watch. The dog sat on the floor of the trunk, her eyes never leaving the cubs. Their home sat on the outskirts of Bozeman, a modest farmhouse with 5 hectares of land backing up to National Forest. Daniel immediately set to work converting an old storage shed into a shelter, while Laura researched what bear cubs needed to survive. "They're probably only about 3 months old," she told Daniel as she mixed formula in the kitchen. "They should still be nursing from their mother, but we can give them a milk replacement for now." Daniel nodded, hammering another board into place. "I'm insulating this as best I can. We'll need a heater too." Ellie had appointed herself caretaker of the dog, whom she'd immediately named Maggie. "She looks like a Maggie," she explained as she bathed the patient retriever in the laundry sink. "She's so skinny, Mom, I can feel all her bones." "She's been giving whatever food she could find to those cubs," Laura said. "She's a good mother." Once the shed was ready, insulated, heated, and lined with straw bedding, the cubs were installed in their new home. Maggie immediately following, claiming a spot in the center of the shed, the cubs gravitated to her, curling against her warm body just as they had in the forest. Ellie brought pillows and stuffed animals from her own room, arranging them around the shed. "So they feel at home," she explained. Bruno, the largest cub, immediately claimed a teddy bear, wrestling with it before curling up with it under his chin. "He's playing," Ellie whispered, delighted. "Look, Mom, he's playing." Laura smiled, though worry still creased her forehead. "They're still wild animals, Ellie. We have to remember that." But as days passed, it became increasingly difficult to see the cubs as wild. Maggie treated them exactly as she would have treated puppies, teaching them to play and explore their surroundings safely. She brought toys from around the yard, an old rubber ball, a length of rope, sticks that she'd carry in her mouth and drop at the cubs' feet. At first, they were confused, but Maggie demonstrated, pawing at the ball, tossing it with her mouth, then looking at the cub expectantly. Bruno was the first to understand. He batted at the ball, then pounced on it like a kitten. Maggie's tail wagged furiously in approval. Soon, all 3 cubs were playing with the toys, tumbling over each other and Maggie in a way that made it impossible for the Carters not to anthropomorphize them. Scout revealed herself to be the clever one, hiding toys in the straw and watching with what looked remarkably like amusement when Maggie had to sniff them out. Clover remained the smallest but showed a special attachment to both Maggie and Ellie, often crawling onto Ellie's lap when the girl sat in the shed reading books aloud to her unusual audience. Every morning, Maggie would press her nose to the ground and begin sniffing in an exaggerated way, teaching the cubs to use their keen sense of smell. Daniel began hiding small treats around the shed and yard, and soon the cubs were following Maggie in a line, noses to the ground, learning to track and find food. "They're like puppies," Ellie giggled, watching them shuffle around the yard on Maggie's heels. "Bear puppies?" Winter deepened, and with it, the bond between Maggie and her adopted cubs. On nights when the temperature plummeted and snow piled high against the shed, Maggie would curl even tighter around her charges, sharing her body heat and licking their fur to stimulate circulation. One such night, a particularly fierce blizzard howled around the Carter home. The family was gathered in the living room when a series of sharp, aggressive barks cut through the storm's noise. Daniel jumped to his feet. "That's Maggie," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Something's wrong." He and Laura ventured out into the storm, fighting their way through snowdrifts to the shed. Inside, they found Maggie standing protectively over the cubs, her hackles raised and teeth bared toward the door. A quick scan of the shed showed nothing amiss, but when Daniel shone his flashlight through the window, a pair of yellow eyes reflected back. A wolf, driven by hunger in the storm to venture close to human habitation, had been prowling around the shed. "She's protecting them from the wolf," Laura whispered, watching as Maggie continued to growl, positioning herself between the potential threat and her cubs. Daniel nodded, a lump in his throat. "She's their mother in every way that matters." The wolf eventually slunk away, but Maggie remained vigilant all night. From that moment on, the Carters never questioned the depth of the bond between the golden retriever and her 3 unusual foster children. As winter slowly released its grip on the mountains and the first hints of spring appeared, the cubs grew rapidly. Bruno was now strong enough to climb onto the wooden shelves Daniel had installed in the shed, while Scout had developed a fascination with the ropes Daniel used to bundle firewood, tugging at them and seeming to study how the knots worked. Clover, though still the smallest, had taken to climbing onto Maggie's back for naps, her small black form a stark contrast against the dog's golden fur. It was this sight that prompted Ellie to snap a photo one afternoon, Clover curled on Maggie's back, paws wrapped around the dog's neck in what looked remarkably like a hug. Proud of the sweet moment she'd captured, Ellie posted the photo to her school social media account with the caption, "My dog Maggie and her bear cub Clover." Within hours, the photo had been shared hundreds of times. By the next day, it had made its way to local news sites, and 3 days later, a neighbor, motivated by concern rather than malice, made an anonymous call to the Montana Wildlife Conservation Department. The Carter family was eating dinner when the knock came at their door. Daniel opened it to find 2 uniformed wildlife officers standing on his porch. "Mr. Carter," the older officer asked, "I'm Officer Jenkins from Wildlife Conservation. We've received a report that you're keeping wild bear cubs on your property. We need to take a look." Daniel's heart sank, but he knew there was no point in denial. "Yes, sir," he said, stepping back to allow them entry, "but there's a story behind it." He explained how they'd found the cubs, how Maggie had already been caring for them, and how they'd feared the cubs would be euthanized if reported. Officer Jenkins listened impassively, then shook his head. "I understand your concern, Mr. Carter, but what you've done is illegal. Wild animals belong in the wild or in proper rehabilitation facilities, not in people's backyards." "Can we see them?" the younger officer asked. Daniel led them to the shed, where Maggie immediately positioned herself in front of the cubs, her posture wary but not aggressive. The officers observed the setup and the obvious bond between the dog and bears. "I've never seen anything like it," the younger officer admitted. "She really thinks she's their mother." Officer Jenkins sighed. Regardless, these bears need to be in a proper facility. They're getting bigger, and eventually, they'll be dangerous, no matter how tame they seem now. A week later, an official letter arrived with the Montana Wildlife Conservation Department seal stamped in red. The Carter family had violated multiple wildlife conservation laws. The cubs would need to be surrendered to the Blue Pines Wildlife Rescue Center 80 kilometers away within 7 days. Laura sat at the kitchen table, the letter in her trembling hands. 7 days, she whispered. Then they'll be gone. Ellie burst into tears. They can't take them. Maggie will be heartbroken. Clover needs her. Daniel placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. I'm sorry, Ellie. We always knew this might happen. They're wild animals, and the law is clear. But they're not wild anymore. Ellie protested. They're family. Daniel had no answer for that. Instead, he retreated to his workshop, where he spent hours making phone calls to old contacts from his ranger days. One name kept coming up, Professor James Wells, a wildlife conservation expert at the University of Montana who specialized in bear behavior and rehabilitation. It's a long shot, Daniel told Laura that night, but if anyone can help us, it's him. Professor Wells arrived 2 days later, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual look of fascination. He spent hours observing Maggie and the cubs, taking notes and occasionally murmuring to himself. Extraordinary, he said finally, watching as Clover climbed onto Maggie's back while Bruno and Scout tussled with a rubber ball nearby. I've never seen interspecies bonding like this outside of captive-raised scenarios. What does that mean for the cubs? Laura asked anxiously. Professor Wells removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully. These cubs have imprinted on the dog Maggie as their mother. They've learned behaviors from her that are entirely dog-like rather than bear-like. Separating them now and placing them in a standard rehabilitation program would be problematic. Daniel pressed. They wouldn't understand how to interact with other bears. They wouldn't have the proper survival skills for wild bears. They would be stressed and confused without the presence of their mother, Maggie. He gestured toward the dog. In my professional opinion, sudden separation would be detrimental to their development and chances of survival. Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. Will you put that in writing, officially? Professor Wells nodded slowly. I'll do more than that. I'll speak directly to the department. This is a unique case that deserves special consideration. While they waited for Professor Wells' intervention, Laura and Ellie began documenting everything. They filmed the cubs playing with Maggie, recorded how the dog taught them to track scents, and captured quiet moments of bonding. Bruno carrying a rubber ball like a prized possession, Scout methodically searching through straw for hidden treats, Clover sleeping curled against Maggie's belly. One 30-second video captured everyone's hearts, Clover sleeping with her paws wrapped tightly around Maggie's neck, the small bear's face pressed into the dog's fur, both breathing in perfect synchrony. Ellie posted this video with a simple caption, "This is love. Please don't separate them." Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the next day, local news stations were calling for interviews, and neighbors were stopping by to offer support. The story spread rapidly through Bozeman and beyond, the tale of a stray dog who had saved 3 orphan bear cubs and the family who had risked everything to help her. People were captivated by the unlikely bond, the maternal devotion shown by Maggie, and the obvious affection the cubs had for their canine mother. Neighbors organized a community gathering in support of the Carter family, not a protest, but a quiet show of solidarity. They shared stories of wildlife encounters, of the thin line between wilderness and civilization in Montana, and of the deep responsibility humans had toward the animals whose habitats they shared. The pressure on the Wildlife Conservation Department mounted. Letters and calls flooded in, many from respected community members, wildlife enthusiasts, and even a few celebrities who had seen the story online. The department found itself in an uncomfortable position: enforce the law to the letter or recognize that this unique situation might call for a creative solution. 3 days before the deadline to surrender the cubs, Daniel received a phone call from Officer Jenkins. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, his voice formal but not unkind, "the department has reviewed Professor Wells's assessment and the considerable public input on your situation." Daniel held his breath, his knuckles white around the phone. "We've reached a decision," Jenkins continued. "It's unprecedented, but given the special circumstances, we're willing to issue a conditional permit for you to continue caring for the cubs." Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. "A permit? Really?" "There are strict conditions," Jenkins warned. "The cubs will need to be moved to a semi-wild enclosure that meets our specifications. You'll need regular inspections and veterinary checkups, and you'll need to work with our rehabilitation specialists to eventually transition the cubs back to the wild." "We can do that," Daniel said immediately. "We have land backing up to the forest. I can build whatever enclosure you need." "There's one more thing," Jenkins added. "This isn't a precedent. We're making an exception based on expert testimony and the unique circumstances. We don't want people thinking they can just take in wildlife whenever they feel like it." "I understand," Daniel assured him, "and thank you." When he shared the news with Laura and Ellie, there were tears and hugs and promises to do whatever was necessary to give the cubs their best chance at eventually returning to the wild. Daniel immediately set to work. He designated 5 hectares of his forested land for the cubs' enclosure, consulting with wildlife experts to ensure it contained the right mix of terrain and natural features. He built a fence that would keep the cubs in but allow smaller wildlife to move freely through the area. He installed monitoring cameras so they could observe the cubs without interfering too much in their natural behaviors. Most importantly, he created a trail from the shed, which the cubs still considered home, to the enclosure, allowing them to gradually transition to their more natural habitat. The first day the enclosure was ready, Maggie led the way. She walked confidently through the gate, then turned back, seemingly encouraging the cubs to follow. Bruno went first, always the bravest, with Scout close behind. Clover hesitated at the threshold until Ellie gently nudged her forward. "Go on," the girl whispered. "Maggie's waiting for you." The change wasn't immediate. For weeks, the cubs continued to return to the shed each night, curling up in their straw nest with Maggie. But gradually, they spent more time exploring their new territory, climbing trees, digging in the earth, and investigating the natural features of their enclosure. Maggie remained with them through it all, but her role began to shift. Instead of leading every activity, she often watched from a distance, allowing the cubs to discover things for themselves. When they found berries on a bush, she didn't intervene unless they approached something potentially harmful. "She's teaching them independence," Professor Wells observed during one of his regular visits. "It's remarkable. She's following the same pattern a bear mother would, gradually allowing her cubs more freedom as they develop skills." Summer arrived, bringing lush vegetation to the enclosure and new experiences for the cubs. Bruno developed a particular talent for climbing, scaling trees with an agility that left Maggie watching anxiously from below. Scout proved to be an excellent forager, using her keen nose to locate roots and insects. Clover, though still the smallest, showed a surprising affinity for water, splashing happily in the small stream Daniel had ensured was included in their habitat. The Wildlife Conservation Department, true to their word, sent specialists regularly. They advised on nutrition, behavior, and gradually reducing human contact. The goal, everyone agreed, was to prepare the cubs for eventual release into the wild, even if that was still a long way off. Ellie found this transition the hardest. She had grown deeply attached to the cubs, especially Clover. But Daniel and Laura helped her understand that loving the bears meant letting them be what they were meant to be, wild animals. "They'll always be part of our family story," Laura told her daughter one evening as they watched the cubs play in the dwindling light. "But their story needs to continue in the forest, where they belong." Ellie nodded, wiping away tears. "I know. I just wish they could stay little forever." But nothing stays little forever. By late summer, the cubs had nearly tripled in size. Bruno was now large enough that his playful swats could knock an unwary person off their feet. Scout had grown more cautious around humans, keeping her distance even from the Carters. Only Clover still sought out human contact, occasionally wandering to the edge of the enclosure when Ellie read books aloud from her special spot just outside the fence. Maggie too had changed. The once scrawny stray was now healthy and strong, her golden coat gleaming in the sun. She had become a beloved family pet, sleeping at the foot of Ellie's bed at night but spending her days with the cubs in their enclosure. The wildlife conservation officers were impressed with the cubs' progress, their developing natural behaviors. Officer Jenkins noted during a late August inspection their foraging effectively, building rudimentary dens, and showing appropriate caution toward humans. Except Clover, Daniel pointed out, watching as the smallest bear accepted a handful of berries from Ellie through the fence. Jenkins nodded. "She's still the most habituated, but even she's spending more time acting like a wild bear than a pet." As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and changing leaves, a subtle shift occurred in the relationship between Maggie and the cubs. They still recognized her, still greeted her with affectionate nudges when she entered the enclosure, but they no longer followed her constantly. They had their own routines now, their own bear lives that included behaviors Maggie had never taught them, behaviors that came from instinct rather than learning. "They're preparing for hibernation," Professor Wells explained when Daniel mentioned the change. "It's purely instinctual. They've never experienced winter in the wild, but their bodies know what to do." Sure enough, the cubs began eating voraciously, putting on weight for the winter ahead. They spent hours digging and shaping dens in the hillside of their enclosure, lining them with vegetation and creating the warm, safe spaces they would need during the cold months. Maggie watched these preparations with what seemed like understanding. She no longer tried to coax the cubs back to the shed at night, instead sitting at the edge of the enclosure as darkness fell, observing their new independence with what the Carters could only describe as maternal pride. The Wildlife Conservation Department made a decision. If the cubs successfully hibernated on their own and emerged in spring showing appropriate wild behaviors, they would be candidates for full release back into the forest. The thought was bittersweet for the Carter family. They had always known this day would come, it was what they had been working toward all along, but the reality of saying goodbye was harder than they had imagined. As the days grew shorter and the preparations more intense, Ellie spent hours sitting by the fence, watching the cubs and talking softly to them, especially to Clover. "You're going to be okay," she told the smallest bear, who still occasionally approached the fence to sniff her outstretched hand. "You're strong now. You know how to be a bear." One crisp October afternoon, as golden leaves drifted down around them, Daniel noticed a change in the cubs' behavior. They were restless, pacing near the back of the enclosure where it bordered the deeper forest. Bruno kept looking up at the mountains beyond, his nose working as he caught scents carried on the wind. "It's time," Professor Wells said quietly, having arrived for one of his regular observations. "They're feeling the call of the wild." The family gathered at the enclosure, standing silently as Daniel opened the rear gate, the one that led directly into the national forest. Maggie sat beside them, her posture alert but calm. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cubs continued their restless movements, not yet noticing the open gate. Then Bruno caught a scent, his head lifting as he registered the path to freedom. He approached the gate cautiously, looking back at Maggie as if seeking permission. Maggie rose and walked slowly to the gate. She touched noses with Bruno for a long moment, then stepped back, sitting once more beside Ellie. It was a gesture of goodbye, of release, that needed no translation. Bruno hesitated only a moment longer before slipping through the gate. Scout followed almost immediately, her clever eyes taking in the vast forest beyond. Only Clover lingered, returning to where Maggie sat to press her head against the dog's chest one last time. Ellie couldn't hold back her tears as she watched the smallest cub, now not so small anymore, say goodbye to the mother who had saved her life. "Take care of each other," she whispered to the bears. Clover finally turned and joined her siblings. The three bears paused at the edge of the deeper forest, looking back one final time at the family and the dog who had given them a second chance at life. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they disappeared into the trees. Maggie didn't howl or chase after them. She simply sat there, her eyes gentle and peaceful, watching the place where her cubs had vanished. She had done what a mother must do, raise them to be strong enough to leave. The Carter family didn't close the gate. The cubs would need time to adjust, to explore, to decide if they were truly ready for full independence. The Wildlife Conservation Department had agreed to this approach, trusting that the cubs would either establish themselves in the wild or return if they weren't yet ready. For 3 days, there was no sign of Bruno, Scout, or Clover. Then on the 4th morning, motion-triggered cameras captured images of the 3 bears exploring the edge of their former enclosure. They didn't re-enter, but they seemed to be checking in, reassuring themselves that their first home still existed. Gradually, these visits became less frequent. The cubs, now nearly yearlings, ranged farther into the forest, establishing their own territory away from human habitation. Wildlife conservation tracking showed them staying together, supporting each other as they navigated their new freedom. Maggie adjusted to her cubs' absence with the same dignity she had shown throughout their unusual journey together. She became more fully a family dog, devoted to Ellie but always alert to sounds from the forest. On clear nights, she would sometimes sit on the back porch, nose lifted to catch scents from the mountains, before returning contentedly to Ellie's side. The story of Maggie and her bear cubs spread far beyond Bozeman. Wildlife magazines published articles about the unprecedented arrangement. Researchers studied the videos and notes the Carter family had compiled, gaining new insights into interspecies bonding and rehabilitation techniques. The Wildlife Conservation Department, initially reluctant to make an exception to their rules, ultimately used the experience to develop new protocols for unusual rescue situations. Officer Jenkins himself became an advocate for flexible approaches to wildlife management, citing the success of the Carter family's unorthodox method. 1 year after the cubs' release, a park ranger reported an unusual sighting: 3 young black bears traveling together in the national forest, showing remarkable cohesion and cooperation. DNA samples from fur caught on tree bark confirmed they were Bruno, Scout, and Clover, successfully adapting to life in the wild, maintaining the family bond they had formed under Maggie's care. In Bozeman, the story of Maggie, the once-abandoned stray who had saved 3 orphan cubs, became a quiet legend. Children read about her in local schools, and hikers in the national forest sometimes claimed to have spotted 3 bears moving together through the trees, their behavior just a little different from other wild bears, carrying with them the legacy of a golden retriever who had taught them about family, about warmth, and about love that transcends boundaries. The Carter family continued to live on the edge of the forest, with Maggie always by their side. They never tried to find the cubs in the wild; that chapter of their lives had closed. But sometimes, on still nights, when the wind carried scents from the mountains, Maggie would lift her head and listen, as if hearing distant voices calling to her across the wilderness. And perhaps, in their own way, Bruno, Scout, and Clover remembered too, the warmth of a golden coat, the gentle guidance of a mother who had chosen them against all odds, and a family brave enough to help them find their way back to the wild, carrying with them the strength that comes from having once been truly loved.